Hello, I'm Terry Christensen, and this is Valley Politics. Today our show is a one-hour special on a unique moment in local history. Here's Santa Clara County Supervisor Ken Yeager to introduce our topic.
Measures A and B, Anita Bryant, Save Our Children, Reverend Marvin Rickard, the Los Gatos Christian Church. When you say these names today, you get a lot of blank stares. But back in 1980, they were at the center of a battle that set back the local gay rights movement for years to come. Measures A and B were a pair of referenda on gay rights ordinances approved by the Santa Clara County Board of Supervisors and the San Jose City Council that would have banned discrimination based on sexual orientation in employment, housing, and public service. Placed on the ballot by the religious right, the two measures required a vote of the people to keep the newly enacted laws in place. The local anti-gay campaign was an extension of a nationwide effort against the LGBTQ community throughout the 70s. Anita Bryant, a one-time Miss America contestant and television pitchwoman for Florida Orange Juice, and her organization, Save the Children, were the public face of the religious rights campaign nationally. The Reverend Marvin Rickard of the Los Gatos Christian Church led the anti-gay effort locally. Over 2/3 of the voters cast their ballots against the ordinances. They did not want gay people like my friends and myself to enjoy the same legal protection from discrimination that everyone else did. Approval of the first ordinance by the Board of Supervisors sparked the beginning of this battle. We have brought together 4 of those supervisors to share their recollections of the law's passage and their perspective on the rhetoric of the campaign. This is a story that is a very important piece of LGBT history that needs to be preserved. It also means a lot to me personally. As a gay man, I remember the hurtful campaign messages and painful loss at the ballot box. For me, it re-energized my focus on the LGBTQ rights and set me on a path that eventually led to political office.
Welcome everyone, and welcome County Supervisors. We're fortunate to have with us today 4 of the 5 county supervisors who voted for the gay rights ordinance in Santa Clara County in 1979. Let me introduce them in order of seniority, starting with Dominic Cortese, elected in 1968. And Dominic, your district was?
East San Jose, downtown, a part of Willow Glen, a little part of Almaden.
That's my district. You were my supervisor.
Thank you. I was glad to have you as a constituent.
And Dan McCorquodale was elected next in 1972. You represented?
Had a portion of East San Jose, Milpitas, Berryessa, a little bit of Santa Clara, and all of Sunnyvale, and a few homes in Mountain View.
Diridon was elected in 1974, representing?
The 4th Supervisorial District, which was the Central West Side District. It had all of Santa Clara, West San Jose, a little bit of Sunnyvale, and then Cupertino and Saratoga.
Jerry Steinberg was also elected in 1974. She represented the North County until 1980. She couldn't be with us today, but we do have the junior member of the County Board of Supervisors. Susie Wilson was elected in 1978.
Yes.
And you represented?
Well, I represented South San Jose and a portion of Willow Glen. And then they, because there'd been a changing of the districts, they dumped all of the unincorporated areas into my district since I had Gilroy and Morgan Hill. So they swooped around and gave me everything that was unincorporated.
Which was much more then than it is now.
Oh,
the
yes.
volume of unincorporated territory. We'll come back to that a little bit later, but I just want to set the scene a little bit more before we get to 1979 and the gay rights ordinance. There was a lot of activity around gay rights in the 70s, starting in the 60s really, and building up. A number of cities and counties had passed gay rights ordinances, and in several, like Dade County, Florida, they were repealed. In California, in 1978, the voters defeated the Briggs Initiative, which would have banned gays from school jobs, and also advocacy of gays or gay rights within the schools. So that was a victory for gay rights. But then shortly after that election, Harvey Milk, the first openly gay elected official in the state, was assassinated along with George Moscone in San Francisco. To me, these things gave impetus to the gay rights movement, both the defeat of the Briggs Initiative and the assassination of Harvey Milk. And that takes us up to 79, but just before that we have to talk about a prequel to what happened to the county, and that's something that happened in the city. Susie Wilson, when you were on the city council, the Gay Pride Week resolution. Tell us what happened.
Well, it filled our whole auditorium, and it spilled down so that people were downstairs in the cafeteria because there were so many people in protest of that event and what we had done. And so that came back to the city council, and it was, when it had passed, it was filled with the auditorium and people downstairs. And the following week, then it was repealed because taken away.
So the council passed a resolution, Gay Pride Week,
yes,
and then repealed it,
and
rescinded it.
Rescinded
Yeah.
it on I guess there were 7 of us, so it was a 5-2 vote. Jim Self and I voted against it, if I remember rightly.
Against rescinding it.
Rescinding it, yes. And I had people that I met. I had all of South San Jose also in my district, and I went to meetings in the homes with people. And the one I remember the most vividly of going to meet with them and asking them what they were afraid of, because there was so much fear involved in it. And I remember saying to one mother, I said, how many children do you have? And she said she had 2 little girls. And I said, you know, the Catholics always said that you give me a child from the age of 0 to 6, I'll have him for life. What makes you think that what you have taught your children could be so easily swayed by a stranger?
So again, this is 1978. You were running for county supervisor.
Oh, yes.
In 1978.
I had doors slammed in my face, yeah. Because I was out in South San Jose knocking on doors, and previously, every time I knocked on a door, I was welcomed into the home, and I had doors just slammed in my face. Are you the one that did this? And I'd say, yes, ma'am, I am. I did. And then they'd slam the door in my face.
The Los Gatos Christian Church
in her district
was a big part. Yeah, the Los Gatos Christian Church was a big part of the opposition to the Gay Pride Week resolution and then the Gay Rights Ordinance in the following year. And that was right in your district,
yes,
your
Marvin
supervisorial district.
Richard was the pastor.
Marvin Rickard.
Marvin Rickard.
Marvin Rickard.
Yeah.
Later, I had a run-in with him, and he said to me, maybe a year later, and he said to me, how could you stand up there and say a prayer before that prayer breakfast, you? And I said, how could you say that you deny anybody the right to pray?
Well, and you heard more from him in 1979. So let's fast forward a little bit now to 1979. And the County Human Relations Commission recommends the gay rights ordinances. Dan, you made the motion. Rod, you seconded the motion. Why did you think the county needed this? Why did you think the county was ready to move on this?
Well, it wasn't really a new issue with me. I had first run into the issue of discrimination with gays when I was in the Marine Corps, when a friend of mine was kicked out of the Corps because somebody saw him coming out of a gay bar in Honolulu. Nobody ever proved he was gay. It was just the idea that maybe he was gay. And so I had run into the issue from time to time, but I was never in a position to really do much about it until the issue came from the Human Relations Commission to the board. Then I had an opportunity to do something, and I thought that it was the right thing to do. I always like to support things that improve equality and justice for people, and I thought this was a perfect example of those issues.
What about you, Rod? You seconded
Well-
the motion. You were ready to go.
I had no hesitation on the issue at all. I'm an Episcopalian. I taught the Sunday school out at the Saratoga Episcopal Church for the previous 14 years, and Episcopal religion allows gays to be priests or whatever, so there's no bias, whatever. And so I felt very comfortable with the issue. The hesitation was that I was getting ready to, and had in the process started to run for the state senate to replace Jerry Smith. And that district had become very conservative with the upsurge of of then Governor Reagan, and the evolution of so-called moral majority. They were now neither majority nor moral, but they were there, and they were very noisy and very well organized, and they were focused in my district, in Susie's district, in the Senate district, and in her supervisorial district. And so I had some trepidations about it. At the same time, I knew I had to vote my conscience, so it was time to go ahead.
Why did you two decide the county should do this? It only applied to unincorporated areas in the county. They were all in her district, Susie's district, or most of them were. Why not just leave it to the cities where most of the people were?
Well, I know my answer is it was symbolic, but it was an important symbol. The trend was changing. There had been a trend during the 70s towards progressive issues, environmental progressive issues, and other progressive issues. And
That's partly how you guys got elected.
That's right. Well, all of us were elected because we were the new progressives in the valley over the old farming community. And that was tipping back the other direction with the leadership of Reagan and the conservative churches. And we really needed to do something to blunt that shift.
Dominic Cortese, you had reservations about this ordinance. What were your reservations?
Well, you know, the national temperament, Terry, was that this is a moral issue. That was an issue between the church or the church's religion and the gay community at that time, gay community. That was where I started. I was in a learning process. I think the entire country was in a learning process. I commend the board members, my colleagues here, for moving forward in a very bold manner. We had a proactive board. We were involved in a number of very, very difficult issues together, and it made sense. It made sense, I'm sure, to my colleagues and to me, that here's another issue we could take on. We've been through a lot. Formation of a countywide transit district, formation of a countywide park district, the Angela Davis trial, the assassination of Harvey Milk and George Moscone. So here's another issue that it seemed to the majority, at least, that we could take on and succeed. Nationally, though, the issue in the public forum was limited. There were only a handful of cities and counties across the country that were involved. Anita Bryant carried the ball in Florida and flubbed it, I think, in Florida for everyone. So it was my feeling that it was premature, that it was a moral issue at that time. It was an issue between religion and individuals, and that's where it should be handled and clarified. I still feel that way, and I still have the feeling that the church, including my church, hasn't done enough. And it's high time that religion and the churches and my church open that door.
We should be clear that the ordinance banned discrimination in employment and housing and access to public services, right? So it was pretty straightforward about those things. After it was introduced at that first meeting, there were 5 more public hearings, so 6 public hearings in total. You all spent a lot of time on this, 25 hours of public testimony. What were those hearings like? What do you remember, Susie?
Noisy.
Were you having fun?
No, I was not having fun. I was amazed at the anger that people could have for one another, against one another, that you could, there was no reasoning to it. There was not making much sense to me that you were talking about people that were just ordinary people, just like they were. And yet there was this fear that created such a hatred.
What were the numbers like at the meeting? Were there more opponents of the ordinance than supporters? What about the phone calls and letters you were getting? I know you got a lot of phone calls and letters. We didn't have email at the time, or you would have had thousands of emails. I
Terry,
bet.
it was at least 10 to 1.
10 to 1.
In opposition.
Opposed to the ordinance. Yeah.
And we knew that wasn't the way it was in the community, really. But the conservative churches were so well organized, and they preached the opposition at the pulpit, that every time they had a Sunday preaching session, Monday our telephones would light up. And we knew that it wasn't a reflection of the real public's concern on the issue.
It actually took a lot of courage for the supporters to speak at those meetings because the numbers were so against them. Dom, you were chairing the board at that time. Were you having fun?
I wasn't having fun. I wasn't intimidated, and there was a job to do, and I had an experienced board. The hearings went, I think, very, very well, thanks to my colleagues here. And thanks to the opponents and the proponents, things went along well. We got in, as I began to point out in my initial comments, we got into issues in this ordinance that no public entity across the country ever got into. We were talking about employment, job opportunity, implementation, penalties. You know, we dug into this, and Rod touched on it. I think the opposition was much better prepared, no question about it. The results indicated that the opposition was much better prepared than we were. And I don't think, as a Democratic Party especially, that we were really ready for this, that we were really prepared for it. The board was willing to lay it all out, but generally speaking, we were just behind the 8 ball. We weren't really ready for it. And as I prepared along the way during part of this, as I prepared, and Dan may comment also, and I think Rod had similar experiences, prepared for election, the issue really wasn't an issue. And I was supported generally by the Democratic caucus, by the Democratic Party.
You were elected to the Assembly in 1980.
Toward
the same year as the referendum.
Yeah, toward the end of this period. So but it just seemed to me that we, apart from the board itself and the individuals, we weren't prepared. Society wasn't prepared. The public entities weren't prepared. And as I prepared, and met with a very unsettled Democratic caucus in Sacramento, rarely was this pointed out to me as a number one issue. We'll take care of it later. And here we were diving in. So my opinion was it was premature. That there's a good chance we're going to lose it, and maybe set things back as a result of it. And who knows where that would have gone otherwise.
To continue on the public hearings, I read that there was an earthquake during one of the hearings. Dan, do you remember that?
It was when Marvin Rickard was providing testimony.
The preacher from Los Gatos
Right.
Christian Church.
And he crawled under the hearing table.
Well,
while the earthquake
that's what you're
occurred.
supposed to do, isn't it?
No faith.
During that whole hearing, it was sort of strange when it looked like we were the enemy and the people in the audience were the friends, and that. But during the break and other times, I had a lot of talk with Reverend Rickard. At one time, I had thought that I was going to be a minister, and it was in the Southern Baptist Church.
Does that surprise anybody?
And so we had a lot of things we could talk about, and in the process of that, getting ready to decide what to do, I have read every Bible of every religion that I'm aware of that exists. So I could always bring up things to him that he hadn't heard about. Well, he didn't know about the Quran. I knew about the Quran, and so I could tell him things about the Quran, or I could tell him things about the Buddhist religion, or the various ones. And so we really got along very well. And so he told me that that was a message from God, that we should not.
The earthquake.
Yeah, that the earthquake was a message from God. And I said, yes, Reverend, it probably was. And he said, it means that you ought not be pushing this initiative. I said, no, you were talking. It's telling you should not be opposed to this issue. And so he got a laugh out of it, but I never convinced him.
No. So August 6th comes. That was the last of the public hearings, and the vote was 4-1. Dominic against, and Rod, Susie, Dan McCorquodale, plus Jerry Steinberg, who's not with us, voting in favor. The county ordinance was very soon followed by a San Jose city ordinance, and almost immediately the petitions start circulating for a referendum to repeal both the county and the city ordinances. Didn't you see that coming?
Oh, yeah.
But you were willing to face it down.
I didn't see it coming.
No?
I was surprised that people didn't understand what democracy was all about.
Well, I could see that with the number of people in that church, if they really wanted to do a referendum, they could. And so I always thought it was a possibility. But I think that I and a lot of the people who were proponents of the measure felt that we had just gone too far at that point.
Too fast, too far.
Well, no, that we had gone too far along the line to accomplishing it. And that if we backed off now, it would just
I see. Yeah.
It would be disheartening to too many people.
Oh, let's be clear. So when a referendum qualifies, the board can act to rescind the ordinance without it going to the vote, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, but you chose not to and went forward.
So then it continued on, and it was a very spirited campaign, but it was pretty clear from the press and just the normal things you'd hear people talk about that it was in trouble from the beginning.
Dominic, I know you advocated for putting it to the voters in the first place rather than passing it as legislation. So,
I thought that it would give it some momentum, give it some impetus, have the credibility and the prestige or influence of the board, and putting it on the ballot as a board would have helped, and it would have demonstrated to us that we were willing to offer this ordinance to the people on our own, to the voters on our own, and under our own initiative. It just seemed to me to be a better approach, a more palatable and acceptable approach. I wanted to comment just briefly on the earthquake.
yeah.
Because as I read the introduction to the item, the agenda item, I got about halfway through, and that entire room began to shake, and those chandeliers were really shaking. And both sides offered divine intervention. That, that it was there. It was a sign on behalf of their position. And I thought about it later, and the only divine intervention that I could think of was that room was crowded and the aisles were jammed. And I did the best I could to adhere to warnings from the fire marshal that I better clear those aisles. So if there's any divine intervention, it was that everything went well.
Fortunately, it did. Not so well for the ordinances when they actually went to the voters in June of 1980. The vote was 65% no in the county and 70% no for the city of San Jose. Do you all remember the campaigns? How would you describe what the campaigns were like? Anybody?
Brutal.
What?
Brutal. Let me describe something to you. It was I think the worst political moment of my life. I was, right after we adopted the ordinance, I was then into, just as with Dominic, we went into our state campaigns.
But yours was a special election in
a s-
April, ahead of even the
It
June
was
primary,
actually
right?
in March.
In March.
And it was a special election in the most conservative area of the county.
Yeah.
And that was the key. The seat that Jerry Smith had won in the early part of the 70s, but he was getting out of because he said he couldn't re-win it because it had become so conservative. And he encouraged me as a friend not to run. Yeah, youthful indiscretion. But coming out of church one day, just before the Senate election, and as the referendum was going strong, every one of the cars at our church had a flyer on the windshield. And when you lifted up the flyer and looked at it, it said that Rod Diridon was a false person. He was actually gay, and that he was running under false colors and should not be elected to the state senate. Those flyers were on the windshield of every car of every church in the district. Well, had walked out with my two little children in each hand and my wife next to me from the church, and I turned around and every eye in the parking lot was on
Wow.
me.
Wow.
And I realized that that election was not going well.
What do some of the others remember about the campaign?
Well, the people who were supporting the ordinance got off to kind of a slow start because there were just not that many of them. They were against 6,500 people from the
The gay
church.
community was not particularly well
And-
organized politically at that stage.
It took a little bit for them to really get geared up and to start raising some money. And finally, they did raise quite a bit of money.
Yeah.
But it was just too big of an election to try to run with just some mailers and flyers. The door-to-door things and the churches.
The traditional structure was in favor of the ordinance, so.
The political leadership of the city
the
and county.
Democratic Party,
Yeah.
the Council of Churches,
Council of
the
Churches,
liberal
yeah.
churches were in favor. I think the chamber was neutral, but many of the leaders of the chamber were in support. The Mercury News, the major daily newspaper, editorialized in support. And so you'd think
And
we'd
the Labor Council.
and the Labor
supported,
Council
yeah.
supported. So you'd think we'd have an easy winner.
No.
But the conservative churches were just so well organized that they steamrolled.
We should probably remind everybody that the county was different then.
I was just going to say that
Go ahead.
The conservative churches had much more influence than they have today.
That's true.
Because we have changed so much
Yeah.
since that time.
Well, the county was 62% white in 1980. It's about 32 or 3% white now. And those churches were predominantly white.
Yes.
Not only, but predominantly. Also, the county was 35% Republican then, and now it's 20% Republican. So it's a much more liberal county now than it was then. We need to kind of keep that in perspective. So the ordinances go down in flames. Did that surprise any of you? Were you surprised, Tom?
No, I wasn't. As I pointed out earlier, I was very leery of the effort in the first place in terms of having Los Gatos Christian Church and the Reverend Rickard. The momentum he had, which has been described here, was rolling along, and I very, very leery, very suspicious. Oddly enough, interestingly enough, during this process, from the first hearing in '79 through the adoption of the ordinance, and the referendum, and finally my election, the Los Gatos Christian people, and I'll describe them, I'll generalize and use them as a marker, were grooming a candidate for the same assembly district I was running in, and a former colleague of Susie Wilson, and oddly enough, during my campaign, and as I thought about it and reflected upon coming here today, as I thought about that issue, didn't surface very much at all. It became, in that election of all things, it became a non-issue. And as I pointed out earlier, even the Democratic establishment, the Sacramento folks were we'll get to that later. So phenomenal in a way that wouldn't be a major issue in my campaign against their guy, you know.
Do you think your vote on the ordinance helped you in that campaign?
I'm not sure.
But it just wasn't, the issue wasn't a big deal in your campaign?
I'm not sure. My district was East Side.
Yeah.
So it was a roll of the dice.
Yeah. It's was the most liberal district.
But it didn't. I was certainly, as I say, the proponents of that ordinance were supporting another candidate.
Yeah.
So I'll leave it at that.
Rod, it was a factor in your Senate race.
It was the dominant factor.
Yeah.
With each of our campaigns, the infrastructure for the Democratic Party came out of Sacramento and was running our campaigns for us. And the fellow who was running my campaign, it was Omar Raines. He was a senator, and he was head of he ran the caucus. And he said, if you vote for this, you're committing suicide. And I said, well, I've got to vote for it, though. That's the way it is. And so they lost interest a bit because my district was conservative. Dom's was liberal. Mine was very conservative. And it was a major factor. At the same time, I learned something in that process. I'd kind of learned it before, but I really learned it. And that is that you vote your conscience. If you don't vote your conscience, you're not worth a damn. And so it was very emancipating for me to get up there and vote what I knew was the right thing to do in terms of my conscience, and then stand on my reputation in terms of my conscience from that time forward. And it was a good thing to do.
And you were repeatedly reelected to the County Board of Supervisors
In
after this.
In 82, I was overwhelmingly reelected in a district that was a little more liberal than the Senate district.
Susie,
Yes.
you were reelected to the County Board in 82 and 86. Did this issue come back to haunt you?
No. No. Never did. Other issues came back
Yes.
to haunt me, but not that.
But not this one.
But not that one.
Dan, what about you? You got elected to the state Senate in 1982.
It was
1982.
Interestingly enough, Dan ran against the same person I was running against, but he had turned out to be a real bum, sexual harassment with his staff and all kinds of things. So the Democratic Party redistricted his district from the west side of Santa
Right.
Clara County into the Central Valley with a little bit in Milpitas.
Right, so a different district, but was it?
Well, in the 80s, I didn't have an opponent, so it didn't hurt me. Obviously, it didn't hurt
in
me.
the 1980,
In the 80s, I was
1980
elected.
re-election
in
to
the
the county
supervisor
board. Yeah.
race.
Then in 82, I ran for.
Well, they couldn't have been too mad at you then if they didn't come up with an opponent.
Well, it was a surprise. I thought
Yeah.
they would. They could have
Yeah.
had time to do it, but nobody did. And so then in 82, I ran for the Senate, and it never even surfaced in this county. I never heard a speech or anything else. But O'Keefe brought it up over in the Central Valley. He thought that would be a big issue over there. Well, as it turned out, it wasn't quite a big enough issue for him, so I won there. So but it did surface. But it didn't, it was like, oh well. Somebody told me, said, well, in fact, the black ministers in Modesto and Stanislaus County endorsed me even after O'Keefe had made a pitch to him that I was a heathen and everything else. But but the minister told me, said, well, that seems like that's your only sin. And he said, I think everybody should have one sin, so I'm going to vote for you. So it didn't really make a lot of difference in my campaign.
There maybe were some other local repercussions. 2 Christian conservatives were elected to the San Jose City Council in 1980. But then things started to turn. There were ballot measures and statewide ballot measures in 86 and 88, all related to quarantining people who were HIV positive or who were AIDS carriers. All of those were defeated. So again, we start to see things change, gradual acceptance. Ken Yeager gets elected to various local offices. We had him introduce our show. today, and it was his idea to actually have this conversation. The Board of Supervisors has established an LGBTQ affairs office in Santa Clara County, once again ahead of other counties across the country. We have same-sex marriage now. Things have changed, not completely. Most other states still don't have anti-discrimination ordinances for LGBTQ people. So California, it took them a long time. 1992 was when the state passed legislation. It took a long time to get there. Looking back now on your votes on this ordinance in 1979, any regrets, Susie?
No.
No? You'd do it again?
Oh, yes.
You'd risk your career again?
Oh, I didn't think it was a risk at all. Yes, but before that on the city council, there was a time when Janet Gray Hayes befriended the gay community.
Yes.
And so that we'd already begun to, the gay community had already begun to speak out. And the city council at that time responded well.
Dan, regrets?
No regrets. This was one of a series of types of things that I was willing to take a risk on in my political career, and most of them turned out very well.
We'll have to ask about the ones that didn't for another interview. Dominic, what about you? Do you regret voting no on this?
No, and again, I have to commend my former colleagues here for the patience and the time and the energy they put in, and the respect that they showed me in chairing during that whole process. Regrets, I've had a chance since that time to serve, from that time anyway, to serve 16 years in the state legislature, and I think that I'm all caught up. I think every vote I cast for the gay community.
So you were there in 1992 for the AB 101
whatever
legislation.
It was. I was there in support, and I never lost the support of the gay community. Never lost the support of Democratic Party, United Farm Workers, or anybody that you would or the gay community would consider a friend and ally. I think my record from that point on illustrated that I was sincere where I was at that particular point in time, and that it was unfortunate, and I know a lot of people were disappointed. I know Ken expressed his disappointment, severe disappointment. On the other hand, I think fate has treated us all well, and especially Ken. I feel good about him.
Good. Rod, regrets?
Oh, no regrets whatever. In fact, it was an emancipating vote in terms of voting my conscience and being proud of it. And part of that was we had some brilliant young staffers at the county. Ken was one of them, working for Susie at the time. He'd started working for me a few months earlier, and went over to Susie's office and was a superstar over there. And Dana Van Gorder, who had worked in my office, was also a young gay man who was student body president up at Sunnyvale High School, and went on to become quite a leader in San Francisco. And watching those young people and how deeply they felt on the issue really helped you have the courage to do the right thing.
So, looking back, and looking forward actually, what's your advice to people who are advocating unpopular causes today, as the gay rights advocates were back in '79? What would you tell somebody?
Are you asking me? I can
I'm asking all four of you.
Vote your conscience.
No, not the decision maker, the advocates.
Yeah.
The advocates?
Yeah.
I think get organized early. And if the advocates for the ordinance, the supporters of gay rights, had organized in our valley, they would have won, without question. All of the traditional political infrastructure, except the conservative churches, supported the ordinance. But they weren't organized, and they were overconfident, if they had been organized, we would have gone through a very different story here.
Advice to advocates of unpopular causes?
Yes, I would say that when you feel something is wrong and you feel it so deeply that you have to stand up and fight it. That's the only way that you ever conquer prejudice, or you conquer sin. You can call it that too, when people disregard the other people. But you feel like you're a better person if you just follow what you believe.
Even if you lose?
Yes.
Even if you lose?
Yes, even if you lose,
right.
because you haven't lost anything inside. You're still you, and they're just wrong.
Dan, advice?
Well, I would say that they should research their issue very well, so they're very easy for them to talk about it. They should research what the opposition is going to say and make sure that they have good responses to that. And then I think that because of my method of campaigning, I can't skip saying, make sure that you've got enough people who are going to walk door to door.
Yes.
To make sure that the
Well,
public really knows.
you're the
and
famous door walker.
Understands your issue, and that who you really are.
Ultimately, that's what the LGBTQ community learned, I think, with some of these statewide ballot measures. That you have to personalize it, you have to go door to door, you have to talk to people. People have to know. It can't all be media or hope for goodwill from people, but that personal contact is really important. Dominic, do you have advice for advocates of unpopular causes?
Yeah, first of all, treat everyone the way you want to be treated. Show respect. Show respect. And if you begin from that golden rule, I think you're going to be treated or respected in turn. Secondly, analyze the issue from every point of view. Make a decision, and as my colleagues have pointed out here, and stick with it. Go on to the next issue. The only thing that's real is now, today. What's past is past. We don't know the future, but do what you have to do today. And I guess that's why we're here.
Yeah. I think we've all learned that persistence is important. You won't win the first time necessarily. You have to go back again and again. I'm pretty sure that's happened to issues you all have advocated over the course of your careers. Let me ask you a different question. Rod, you started to answer this before. What's your advice to elected officials facing tough decisions like the one you faced in 1979? Packed council chambers, people angry and upset at you. What's your advice to the elected officials?
Be respectful to both sides in the debate, but stick with your conscience. I think people elect elected officials not because of their policy positions at the time, but because of their philosophical positions generally. And if you stick with your philosophy of human rights and fairness and so on, which is what I tried to do in the context, then you're going to be all right in the long term.
Dan, what's your advice?
Well, I think that elected officials ought to try to stay as broad-based as they can on their constituencies, that they're representing not just one particular interest, but they're representing a broad group. If somebody is 100% environmentalist, and then they have to vote something that's negative for the environmental community, then all at once most of their committee, their supporters are gone. But if they were also at the same time working on transportation, on water, on justice issues, a whole range of things, then there's a broader base of people there. Too many times today we read about, well, they're just an environmentalist, or they're just a labor person, or they're just a X, Y, or Z. And so I think that if you want to represent people, you need to be representing the people who you're serving, not just one category of people.
Dominic, what's your advice to an elected official with a tough decision?
First of all, try to explain to your constituency what the issue is all about, and that's difficult. It was much more difficult in our day and age. We didn't have computers. We had a couple of staff people, and there was no social media. but convey to your constituency as a leader what the issue really is. Define the issue, and be a prophet in terms along those lines. Try to stay ahead of the pack as you move along. Once you've made a decision, and it's in good faith and in good conscience, as everyone else has pointed out here, stick with it. Stick with it.
Susie Wilson?
Well, I remember one time my staff member was Bob Brownstein.
Bob Brownstein.
And I was going downstairs and facing what was going to be a losing cause for me, which was on gambling, because I don't believe in gambling, that government should be involved in gambling. And so I said, and Bob Brownstein is one who likes to gamble, so there we were opposed to that. He was on opposite sides, and so he asked me what I was going to do, and I said, I'm just going to duck this one. I'm just going to go out and probably go to the bathroom at that time. I said, I'm just not going to do anything about it. So later, when I went back upstairs, he said, what happened to you? I thought you were going to duck out. And I said, every time that I get myself backed into a corner, I just come out swinging. And that's what I did. I voted my conscience. You've got to do that.
Vote your conscience. All right. Was there some part of this story we didn't get told just now that you wanted to talk about, or that came to your mind as we were preparing for the show? I don't want to leave anything out.
And I'll
Susie?
say something
Yeah.
about the colleagues that you have on the council
Yes.
or on the Board of
Yes.
Supervisors. You really get to know each other. You know where your strengths are, and everybody, my friends' strengths are maybe their weaknesses. But when we got down there and we started voting, we really were not only collegiate, but we respected each other. And I think that's one thing that politicians really need to learn today, is how to respect that other viewpoint. But because you never can tell where they're going to be your ally on a
Yeah.
tough issue.
Yeah, times have changed,
Yes.
I think.
You know who shared that with us when we were very young on the board? I was precocious, I have to confess. And when I first came on the board, I had a tendency to try to grandstand and Sig.
No.
Dear, yes, and dear Sig took me
Sig
aside.
Sanchez,
Sig
who
Sanchez,
was represented your district
who was the
then, yeah.
dean of the board of supervisors.
Been there a long time, yeah.
And a wonderful gentleman.
Yeah,
And a conservative Republican.
yeah.
And the only one left on the board by the time we got there. He took me aside and he said, when you criticize a member of the board publicly, the public doesn't understand the difference between board members, and they think less of the whole board. So don't do it. And I did it again, and he handed me my head in the debate. And so I learned that collegiality was important. A couple of years later, I became the senior member, and he retired. And he gave me his bar. He had a bar in his office where he brought people in and gave them a drink if they were a bad person, and gave them a lecture. He gave me the bar, and he says, now it's your job to maintain collegiality on the board. And we tried. And I think it's still there on the Board of Supervisors. You see some city councils where they scream at each other and call each other names. It doesn't happen on the Board of
No,
Supervisors.
much better on the board, you're right. Dominic, did you want to add anything?
Well, again, I just appreciate the mutual respect, and almost immediately after this particular issue was behind us, I think we each shared support and encouragement, endorsements, and whatever else was needed to advance our careers. So I think the mutual respect that resulted from this and a number of other issues was life-altering.
There's one person that I would recognize as having a role. There were a lot of people who were leaders on the effort to pass these measures. But at one point I had an appointment to the Human Relations Commission, and I appointed a person who was going to come out and he did come out about the time he got appointed, Dave Stewart. And although he at times turned out to be controversial, he was he did what he needed to do in that he got a unanimous vote from the Human Relations Commission to send it to the board, which gave us a base on which we could say there is support for this issue, and that they have found that people are discriminated against in these areas. And so I think he was sort of a spark plug at the time that lit the firecrackers of us that were on the board.
Yeah, I think often people don't take the commissions very seriously, but that was an important appointment that you made. That was an important recommendation that the HRC, Human Relations Commission, made, and commissions do play that role. Plus, it's a pretty good way to start to learn about how politics and government work, isn't it? So people should think about
Who you appoint.
well,
No, appoint.
apply.
Apply.
but also
Yeah.
the
Terry, you
yeah.
asked a question,
Yeah.
and we may have been somewhat remiss, not intentionally, overlooked the role of Jim McEntee.
Oh yeah, he was the
we-
professional director of the
Yes,
HRC.
he was the director of the Human Relations
Yeah.
Commission, did a phenomenal job, not only in this issue, but he gave of himself just unconditionally. Jim, we most of us, or at least a majority, were involved in creating the Human Relations Commission and hiring Jim as the first director. During that time, as a little aside anyway, we created the Commission on the Status of Women, the Commission on Drug Abuse and Alcoholism,
Heritage Commission.
Heritage Commission. But number one, first and foremost, was Jim's role as director of that commission, and our respective appointees to that commission. Jim's legacy has lived on, and we're all, I'm sure, supporting that legacy in the best way we can.
It's interesting that Jim was a Catholic priest at one time, and his wife was a nun. And then, of course, they left the church, but they respected the Catholic religion. And the Catholic Church was split on the issue. Some of the more liberal portions of the church supported the ordinance, and many of the more conservative aspects opposed it. But it was never a question in Jim's mind.
It's great to give credit to McEntee and Dave Stewart, and of course a lot of others were involved as well. You know, since we've got you all here together and you served during a certain era, I wonder what you think about your larger legacy in county government. Are you proud of where county government got today? Now, Dominic Cortese, we might need to excuse from this because his son, as we all know, is president of the board, but what do you think about the way the county's functioning nowadays? Susie?
Very well,
Yeah?
really. Because these times are so different. Money is so different
Yeah.
these days, and budgets are so different. And yet, I'll speak from what they're doing now as far as the county hospital is concerned, because they've put their money, their budget, into those things that concern the people in need. And the county hospital has become one of the premier hospitals in this area, because the Board of Supervisors believe in
Yeah.
what they're doing. They're taking care of people.
Dan, what's your rating?
Well, I would say the park system and the hospital. Those are two areas that I
Park system's great, yeah.
Yeah.
had where there was a crisis that it could have gone the other way. Rod and I put our lives on the line, almost literally,
Again.
in not letting the hospital get taken away and turned over
Yeah.
to the private sector. And we finally got rid of the director that thought she was
Yvonne.
going to be the czar of a private hospital there. And the park system was going to go for 5 cents on the tax rate. And I'd held 50 house meetings on it, and I was convinced that the public would support 10 cents. And I took a risk, came out opposed to the 5 cents, and would only support it for 10 cents, and that was changed. So I love those two facilities.
Dominic, other than the president of the board, how do you think county's doing
Well,
now?
I think you kind of led me into it. Dave is my legacy.
That's a pretty great legacy.
My pride.
You done
Yeah.
good.
And if I
Yeah.
had him here today, I mean, if I could have, I would have had him represent me here today. And I would have been much more represented, I think.
Well, you did fine, and we're glad you were here. Rod?
Well, it's interesting that the board makeup now is very similar to the board makeup we had at that time. 4 Democrats, all fairly liberal, 1 conservative, a moderate, who's collegial and gets along well with people. So there's an interesting dynamic that's parallel to what we were involved with. And they're taking up some very progressive issues. Great respect to young David Cortese. He's a fine leader. Oddly enough, which never happened in my experience, he's in his 3rd year term as president of the board.
3rd consecutive year,
We
yeah.
never had it.
No.
I had it 2 years as I was leaving because they gave it to me because I was first one term limited. But other than that, we've never had a multiple year chair, and David's in his 3rd year, and that's a real credit to him. I think they're doing a wonderful job, and especially high marks in terms of collegiality and in transparency for the public, their openness.
Well, I'm pretty sure they'll like the reviews you all just gave them. Supervisors, we're out of time. Thank you so much for being with us today and helping us relive in a really important moment in local history. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry.
That's our show for today. We hope you'll join us again next month. Meanwhile, you can catch up on previous shows on our website at createtvsj.org or on YouTube by searching for Create TV San Jose. And you can let us know what you think about our show and suggest future topics or guests by email at valleypolitics@createtvsj.org, on Twitter at valley_politics, and by following us on Facebook. And now that's all, folks. Thanks for watching Valley Politics. See you next time.